This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
This year's Global Climate Conference, COP27, is underway in the Egyptian Red Sea port city of Sharm-el Sheikh. Delegates are gathered there in the backdrop of a recent spate of deadly climate shocks. For Africa, two issues stand out: climate finance and just energy transition. Africa is pressing developed partners to keep their word on cash for mitigation and adaptation. It is also saying that it is wrong and unjust to hurry it in abandoning fossil fuels. But will Africa get its way? This week on the program, we examine the state of the continent's energy sector, the challenges it is facing, and propose solutions. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, Africa's energy crisis is a paradox. It is a story of scarcity amidst plenty. The continent's reservoir of fossil fuels is vast, but lying largely unexplored and untapped. Its renewables are arguably the world's largest, particularly solar. But again, that's lying latent. The long and short of it is that Africa remains energy deficient, with over 600 million people on the continent with no access to electricity. Yet, without energy, Africa cannot power itself to prosperity. The consequence is that some of the world's poorest live on the continent. To turn the tide and uplift millions out of poverty in line with the UN's SDG goals and the African Union's Agenda 2063, Africa needs cash to exploit its vast potential in both renewables and non-renewables for now. Well, the COP27 serves as an opportunity for African leaders to voice their unique needs in climate crisis. And those who attended the UN Climate Change Conference demanded sufficient funding, technical support to ensure a sustainable future and just energy transition. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
Rwanda, like the rest of Africa, is ready to prioritize renewable energy. We do this for our own future. The point is not to generate carbon credits so that others can continue using coal, even as Africa is discouraged from exploiting its fossil fuel resources. The most valuable contribution that the developed countries can make is to reduce their emissions faster while investing with Africa to build sustainable green power. Questioning whether Africa is ready to make use of climate finance should not be used as an excuse to justify inaction. We have seen the effects of this thinking during the pandemic. Vulnerable nations cannot rely on external financing alone. We need public-private partnerships.
Our continent will need a predictable, appropriate, and at-scale funding stream and technological support. This must support our right to development, international equity, and transmissions that are just and inclusive. This then places a great deal of responsibility on developed economies to honor their commitments to those countries with the greatest need and countries that confront the greatest environmental, social, and economic effects of climate change.
Let's be clear, we are for the climate. We are in favor of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But Africa cannot accept that our vital interests are undermined on the matter of energy transition.
Well, let's now bring in our panel of guests. In Sharm-el Sheikh, Wale Shonibare, Director of Energy, Financial Solutions, Policy and Regulations at the African Development Bank. Also in Sharm-el Sheikh, Dr. Karim El Adam, Professor of Nuclear Engineering and Renewable Energy at the Cairo University. And joining us from Johannesburg, Tandile Chinavanu, Climate and Energy Expert at Greenpeace Africa. A warm welcome to you all and thank you for joining us on the program. Tandile, let me start off with you because Africa's energy crisis is a paradox. The continent has an abundance of fossil fuels and particularly renewable energy, yet Africa remains energy deficient. What is the state of energy on the continent?
The concern that we have with the state of energy in Africa right now is that despite, as you mentioned, we've got this abundance of resources, we simply lack the political will to actually enact the necessary measures that will allow us to exploit those resources, particularly sunshine and wind, which we have in abundance, that we could potentially be using to generate electricity. But unfortunately, even though we're seeing renewable energy growing in numbers in terms of its use on the continent, we still are dwindling in terms of the amount of renewable energy capacity that we could be making use of. And there is a great potential for that. It presents many co-benefits, not just socioeconomically because of how fast and easy it is to adapt relative to other power sources or energy sources, but also because it would actually help us in our mitigation targets as well. So if we could see how this meet us with that, we could see great changes.
That conversation has been with us, Tandile, for quite a while in terms of Africa's abundance, particularly on renewables. You know, other countries, the developed countries, and now in transition to renewables. Why is Africa lagging behind on this, despite the vast resources?
There is a great need for investment on the continent, especially in these renewable energies. The appetite is growing, and that has been largely thanks to subsidies that have allowed for it to become affordable enough for a lot more countries, as well as even private companies, to pursue the use of renewable energy. And I think there is a mindset that because we have, an abundance of fossil fuels, that those need to be exploited. But our relationship with those has been quite tumultuous on the continent, and we need our leaders to wake up to the reality that renewable energies offers us an opportunity to stabilize our energy systems, grow our energy systems in some instances, and also to provide us with an opportunity to expand energy to areas where it currently isn't available, and decentralize that access to energy.
Right. While Africa's energy potential, especially renewable energy, is enormous, what kind of investment is required to reap that potential?
Yes, Africa is blessed with abundant renewable energy resources, and there's an opportunity right now for Africa to become an energy superpower. As the world moves towards net zero, you'll find that Africa is able to export green energy, and this is where all the discussion around hydrogen is relevant. And we have the land, we have the irradiation, we have the wind, and we just need to bring in the investment that allow us to support export of green ammonia and green hydrogen that give us the revenues to develop our own domestic energy systems. So I think over the next few years, we're going to see a dramatic change. The other exciting thing is around carbon trade. Again, Africa is going to be able to benefit from being the lungs of the world with our carbon sinks, with our forests, and countries will be able to realize revenues from selling carbon credits. Again, this provides opportunities to realize monies for investment into local infrastructure.
So what kind of investment is required? When we talk about, how much is the funding gap required to reap the benefit from renewables especially?
Well, I mean, there are various figures that you're going to come across that says we have to be spending, 13 $30 billion every year to enable us to achieve universal access by 2030. And the thing is to recognize that different parts of Africa require different investments. So in North Africa, where you have 99% energy access, but they need to decarbonize their grid. In East Africa, you have geothermal and as well as hydro resources. And in West Africa, it's mostly gas-based. And South Africa has a massive renewables program. So there's investments that will help the country increase energy access and also develop more in a sustainable manner. So each region is going to develop according to its natural resources, but we also have to think in terms of the continent, develop a continental master plan, and this is where the AFCFTA is very relevant, the Africa Free Trade Area, the largest free trade area in the world with over 1 billion people. By 2040, Africa's population is going to double. So it's important that we're able to trade across the continent, and trading energy, electricity is also important. One other area is clean cooking, because you have to discourage the cutting down of forests and introduce more sustainable ways of meeting the needs for cooking fuels. So there's a lot to do, but there's also a new momentum that we're seeing.
Dr. El Adam, our governments need to invest heavily in the energy sectors, particularly in the renewables. But we are still hearing, and I want to come back to that position, we are still hearing statistics of some 600 million people on the continent unconnected to the grid. And we do know that without energy, Africa cannot power itself to prosperity. Now, if half the continent's population is without electricity, what does this mean, though, for economic development? What would be needed to turn the tide on Africa's energy consumption?
I think that it will be very important to access to renewable energy projects, but that needs a lot of investment that is very essential, and also that needs also changing the concern itself, because now all the African countries, they are depending on the fossil fuel, which has a very bad effect on the weather and also on the climate, and also there is no big renewable projects in Africa. Then I think that needs changing the mentality itself, changing the economic access, and also that will be change that needs also a lot of security and a lot of good relations between the African countries, because as you know, for example, in Europe there is a network, electrical network joining all the countries. We need this in Africa, and we need to improve and to develop the renewable energy sources, as we said before, solar, wind, and waterfalls. And Africa is rich of these sources, but it needs good investment and also good infrastructure.
Tandile, what would you consider, though, a viable energy mix that would be suitable for the continent?
Well, it's challenging to attribute one particular energy source for the entire continent, considering that we have a variety of resources in our particular areas that we're more adept to use. So, for example, certain areas of Africa have an abundance of water, which they're able to pursue hydroelectric power. But in other areas, we may not be able to pursue those. But ultimately, the pathway that we need to take needs to allow for a suitable energy mix, which is affordable and quickly adaptable to bridge the gaps that we have in energy distribution. And particularly, it must be able to be brought online quickly. It must be affordable, because we still have many areas in Africa where accessibility is an issue. But it must also, at the end of the day, be safe, because the last thing we want is for energy sources to be compromising the health and safety of communities, which is what we've seen going on for far too long, that energy has been provided at the expense of many communities that are in proximity to the mines where these energy sources are extracted, or they are within reach of these power stations that are generating the electricity. So we want to see an energy mix that is safe for everyone and also sustainable in its ability to provide power for us.
While without energy, Africa cannot power itself, cannot prosper. Now, what needs to be done, though, to turn the tide of power consumption?
In relation to the state of energy in Africa, we have 600 million people without access to energy. And that is an emergency that we have to address. And the other thing is about the state of our utilities. Many of our utilities are virtually bankrupt. There's a need to reform the utilities. There's a need for us to build regional interconnections. There's a need for us to develop more flexible financial instruments. And there's a need for us to introduce more regulations to support private sector investment in the sector. These are all issues that the African Development Bank has been addressing through various instruments. We're seeing the results of that effort across the board. Also introducing grid stabilization systems to allow us to be able to anchor more renewable energy. And the good thing is also that the cost of solar and wind power renewables has been dropping quite significantly over the past 10 years. So I think it's an optimistic picture, although we still have to address the financing issue. Africa does not get its fair share of climate finance, and it's important that we mobilize as much financing as possible from developed countries, as well as internal mobilization of local savings to be able to support the infrastructure investment that we need.
On that note, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we will find out what just transition means for Africa and the investment options in renewables, as well as energy security for the continent. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now continue with our discussion on Africa's energy potential. Joining us from Sharm-el Sheikh in Egypt is Wale Shorin-Bare, Director for Energy Financial Solutions, Policy and Regulation at the African Development Bank, AFDB. In Johannesburg, Tandile Yavanu is still with us, climate and energy expert at Greenpeace Africa. And Sharm-el Sheikh, also joining us from there, Dr. Karim El Adam, Professor of Nuclear Engineering and Renewable Energy at Cairo University. Tandile, you know, there's a lot of talk about a just transition and a desirable energy mix. I mean, we talked about that in our earlier discussion. In terms of Africa's search for a balance between development and climate compliance, what exactly is this just transition about?
Well, essentially, particularly in coal communities or coal-dependent communities, there's been a shift over the years as we've seen a decline in extraction of coal in the industry as a whole. But essentially, a just transition would center people in some of these mine closures that we're seeing taking place, and ensuring that despite the shifting in the economies of these regions, that they prioritize capacitating people, upskilling them, and ensuring that these locations do not become ghost towns in a sense. So a just transition allows for us to center people, justice, as well as climate justice in our transition away from heavy emitting fossil fuels and moving towards renewable energy that could provide many solutions for these communities.
Dr. El Adam, you know, as we talk about transition, I mean, you're in the nuclear field. As we talk about Africa transitioning from fossil fuels, in the longer term, though, what would African countries need to take into account in order to successfully achieve that energy transition?
I think that for Africa, or for the continent, that needs planning from now, and a lot of research, scientific research. Also, we wanted to develop our infrastructure. We wanted to develop our skills, and also we wanted to have a big investment and to have relations with companies, either international or national companies, to have investment in this, then that will be in the long range of Africa for renewable energy projects.
All right. Tandile, Africa is talking about also starting to make a transition to renewables. How is Africa making a balance, though, between developing its energy sector vis-a-vis the environmental concerns, particularly as developed countries begin energy transitioning?
Well, we're currently struggling with this balance. I think there's a dissonance between our development objectives and the execution. So what we're seeing is our leaders are aligning themselves or supporting the adaptation of projects that have very neo-colonial or imperialist roots in them, connecting themselves with carbon majors, the likes of Shell, Total, that are, that are based on extractivism and have a very tumultuous history in Africa and have been linked to a number of human rights violations, as well as conflict that has been supported by these carbon majors, pollution and deterioration in public health that they've contributed extensively towards. And so what we're seeing is our government is actually not prioritizing the people, which at the end of the day, despite the multitude of fossil fuel projects, oil and gas projects that they are supporting on the continent, the wealth isn't being translated or transferred to those who who they imply would benefit, and that's the people. So we want to see our government prioritizing renewable energy access, because that could really help bridging that gap of the energy supply, but also delivering energy in an equitable and safe manner.
Right. Wale, let me come back to you on what the AFDB is doing, because the AFDB's New Deal on Energy for Africa, which is aimed at achieving universal access to energy across the continent by 2025, which is just 2 years away. Now, it wants to achieve 100% access in urban areas and 95% access in rural areas. How is this going to be achieved?
Yeah, well, I mean, we set out some very significant ambitions for the continent when the New Deal was introduced in 2016. Obviously, 2025 is around the corner, and we were aiming high for the continent. The new, more realistic figure is probably 2030. But there are various elements to what we're looking to achieve with the New Deal. We have the Desert to Power program, which is looking to spend $20 billion across 11 countries in the Sahel to provide electricity to over 250 million people. And that is a 10 gigawatt program to create the world's largest solar zone, and that work has already started. There's work that we're also doing in other parts of the continent, but it's important that we look at the regulatory environment and we help countries plan their energy needs. So part of what we do is, apart from the money that the bank is investing, we're also mobilizing investments from both local and international partners in order to be able to do this. We're also building out transmission and distribution infrastructure across the continent.
Tandile, I want to look at very briefly at Africa's common position, because ahead of COP27, Africa had a position: either release adequate climate finance for energy transitions, or Africa will explore natural resources to protect the people from climate change impacts and economic and social developments. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a very concerning position for us to take, considering that we as people have invested agency in our African leaders by democratically electing them. And this approach reinforces some imperialistic narratives. It positions us as powerless in this equation. But ultimately, there is power that these leaders have to be able to mobilize and ensure that we are on track, not only in terms of our mission trajectories, but as well as in our commitments to meeting our energy transition needs. And I think there is a narrative that is also being painted that we are incapable of leapfrogging certain technologies, especially fossil fuel technologies, and that we need to exploit these in order to meet the global north. But ultimately, we as Africans have charted our own path time and time before, and We've leapfrogged technologies in communications as well as finance. If we invest, we can continue to explore and expand our energy without necessarily taking the very detrimental path of fossil fuel extraction, which has been detrimental to our health and our socioeconomic outcomes as a continent.
Right, so I want to get your final comment here. And Tandile, let me start off with you, because the global clean energy transition holds new promise for Africa's economic and social development. So how can African countries position themselves today to cushion against new risks and to seize emerging opportunities?
Well, a major risk that we are facing right now is that we're lagging behind in terms of the transition. And I think it's the World Bank that released a report, or rather index, on global transitions and energy transitions, and most African countries rank quite low on that index. And the reality is that if we are unable to adapt and move forward and allow for us to our energy systems to catch up to that of the world, we'll find ourselves facing immense risks, in fact, that we're left behind economically and unable to compete on that level. So it's important that in order to position ourselves for the future and the energy mix of the future, that we invest in renewable energy because of how quickly it is to adapt relative to fossil fuel projects. So if we are able to invest in renewable energy projects, that can also provide decentralized access to energy for many people on the continent. And I think over the past 2 decades, we've seen an immense increase in the amount of people that are having access to energy each year. So it's gone up from about 8 million people in the early 2000s to about 24 million Africans having access to energy now as far as 2019. But unless we can ensure that the energy that we are creating is affordable, then it does not count for much. So we need to ensure that by investing in renewable energy, that we're actually increasing the accessibility to electricity, because it is one of the cheapest forms of energy to today. And so our governments need to prioritize access to energy, not just the infrastructure that enables its access.
All right. Dr. El Adam, you know, the COP27 has been talking about investment in renewable energy production as well as security, energy security. There are major discussion points at COP27. So what are your expectations, though, of the outcomes of the climate conference?
I think that will be a good opportunity to have some decisions concerning the duties of the developed countries and all the other countries, because that needs, now it is a global, which is suffering from this, and also the danger is, the risk is big for all the countries. Then we have to take some decisions, and also some real decisions which can be implemented, both from the technical point of view and also the economical point of view, and taking into consideration the social and economic factors of the countries which will implement these decisions and recommendations. And I think we have to take it, trustedly.
And that is all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Sharm-el Sheikh, Wale Shonibare, Director for Energy Financial Solutions, Policy and Regulation at the African Development Bank. Also in Sharm-el Sheikh, Dr. Karim El Adam, Professor of Nuclear Engineering and Renewable Energy at Cairo University. And in Johannesburg, Tandile Chinyavanu, Climate and Energy Expert at Greenpeace Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.